Hi. In November of 1377, the Crown Prince Juan I of Aragon, the Governor General of the region, arrived in the town of Huesca. There, he zealously pursued charges against a Christian thief and the Jewish community who were accused of selling and buying 3 stolen pieces of the sacred host. The ensuing investigation and trials resulted in 3 executions. The thief by quartering, and a Jewish couple by burning, with the husband being castrated first. In addition, even though the hosts were never located, 3 Jewish men and their families were held in prison until the trials were halted in May of 1378 when the Crown Prince fell ill. During the time that Juan oversaw these trials, he and his father, King Pedro IV, exchanged a series of letters in which the king emphasized the need for the prince to halt the trials and protect the Jews. And the prince defiantly claimed that as leader of the Catholic faith, he had an obligation to carry out the trials. Scholars such as Yitzhak Beyer have suggested that contemporary religious movements and youthful zeal influenced Juan's rebellious behavior and his approach to the Jews of Huesca. While religious convictions cannot be completely dismissed, I agree with David Nierenberg's argument in Communities of Violence that violence against minorities cannot be fully understood in isolation from the political, economic, and cultural circumstances within which it occurred. By placing the trials of Huesca within the context of Pedro's reign, I will show that Juan's prosecution of the Jews is also indicative of a momentous power struggle between the crown prince and the king, in which Juan utilized the trials of Huesca to cast doubt on his father's weakened kingship and assert his own sovereignty. To better demonstrate the political struggle that took place, I will also analyze the language of 2 letters, excerpts of which are translated for you in the handout, in which the king attempted to defend his authority against Juan's challenge, and Juan sought to advance his own sovereignty. From the time of his succession until his death, it seemed that Pedro was at war. From 1356 until 1366, Pedro participated in the War of the Two Pedros, a bitter border conflict between Aragon and Castile, during which Pedro barely even succeeded in recovering those lands taken by the Castilians. In addition, throughout his reign, Pedro continuously struggled to maintain control over the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, whose inhabitants wished to regain their independence. Although previous battles had diverted substantial amounts of energy and resources from the kingdom without a favorable outcome, Pedro was again gearing up to crush resistance in Sardinia in the year leading up to the trials of Huesca. As a result of his constant, mostly unsuccessful military exploits, Pedro appeared weak and incompetent, a perception that Juan alluded to in his letters. Pedro's own subjects did not prove any easier to control. During the War of the Two Pedros, the king was forced to rely on municipal armies to resist invasions and raids implemented by the Castilians. Due to a lack of military funding and the loss of personal property, many of these armies resulted to regularly raiding Castilian villages in direct transgression of written orders handed down by the crown. Moreover, many were unhappy with the royal imposition that soldiers of the kingdom fight on foreign battlefields, while the king did nothing to relieve the hardships they faced on a daily basis. Yet, as noted in 1377, Pedro was preparing again to send troops to Sardinia to reestablish control. The defiance and opposition displayed during the War of the Two Pedros and the king's military exploits in Sardinia reflects the people's lack of deference to and discontent with the king. In 1377, Juan may have perceived this dissatisfaction as evidence that the population would sympathize with rebellious activity against Pedro. Pedro simultaneously damaged his relationship with the nobility. Earlier in that year, the king married his mistress, Sibylla of Fortier, a daughter of a minor noble named Ampurius. Sibylla immediately began promoting her friends and family, much to the discontent of the older aristocracy, who subsequently lost influence at court. Thus, by 1377, much of the population, both aristocratic and common, seemed to have lost faith in their king and his ambitions. The economic situation of the kingdom was not any more optimistic. Frequent droughts, invasions of locusts, and periods of plague resulted in a debilitating kingdom-wide inflation that lasted from 1340 to 1380. In addition, Pedro's constant military exploits proved to be very expensive. Such factors contributed greatly to Pedro's lack of revenue. In order to continue displaying his political authority and military dominance, Pedro was compelled many times to request taxation from the Cortes, regional parliamentary-like institutions comprised of ecclesiastical and secular nobility. Between 1350 and 1387, Pedro met with the Cortes in Catalonia 18 times, and that in Aragon 15 times. These constant requests enabled the Cortes to demand that the king concede aspects of judicial and economic authority to them. These concessions created a stranglehold on Pedro's sovereignty that would have dealt a huge blow to his identity as king and, in conjunction with the kingdom's economic woes, would have caused his subjects and his son to question the legitimacy of his rule. When Pedro was unable to obtain the necessary funds from the Cortes, he turned to the Jewish community. Around the turn of the 13th century, records indicate that the Jews made up about 6% of the total population. But in cities like Barcelona and Huesca, where the Jewish population was larger and more influential, they constituted more than 10%. In the centuries leading up to the trials, many of the Aragonese rulers sought to maintain a relationship with the Jews that was economically beneficial. Influenced by this tradition, Pedro recognized the Jews as, quote, royal treasure, a title that signified his claim over the community and their finances. During his military exploits, Pedro relied heavily on revenue from Jewish communities and pushed them to come up with immediate large sums of money. This dependence resulted in the popular perception of the Jews as agents of royal power. By 1377, the regularity of such a demand led to the immigration of some Jews outside of the king's regional jurisdiction in order to avoid destitution. Due to the economic woes of the kingdom and the lack of support from his subjects, the Jews represented an essential source of Pedro's authority. Consequently, the departure of even a few Jews was a concern for the king, a factor that Juan would have been aware of and likely influenced the manner in which he challenged Pedro's sovereignty. Juan's relationship with the Jews prior to 1377 and after he ascended the throne is also significant. In another letter, Pedro mentioned the case of 1367, which bore a striking resemblance to the Huesca trials. As a young man, Juan had already acquired the title of Governor General, which gave him control over the inhabitants of a few prominent cities and their surrounding territories, including the local Jewish communities. Although the Jews owed allegiance solely to the king, as Governor General, Juan retained jurisdiction over their crimes. Using this authority in 1367, Juan prosecuted the Jews of Barcelona, who were also accused of stealing pieces of the host. While this was certainly not the first case of such accusations in the kingdom, the trials were exceptional since, as with the case in Huesca, Juan pursued charges in direct defiance of his father's wishes. It is important to note that the Barcelona trials occurred immediately following the less than satisfactory conclusion of the War of the Two Pedros. Without a doubt, Juan understood in 1367, as he did in 1377, that antagonizing the Jews of Barcelona and Huesca directly threatened an important source of the king's authority and called into question his father's ability to rule the kingdom efficiently. Moreover, it is curious that when Juan finally succeeded his father as king in 1387, his antagonistic stance towards the Jews seemed to instantly disappear, and he adopted a similar amicable approach that his father and the rulers before him had employed. In addition, during the 1391 uprisings, Juan attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to protect the Jews of the kingdom. This effort also demonstrates the importance of the Jews to Juan's own self-image of authority and power. Considering the context of the Huesca trials, the prince's motives during the years of 1377 and 1378 seemed to be politically motivated, implemented at a time when the king was at an obvious disadvantage. By pursuing accusations against the Jews of Huesca, Juan threatened a viable source of authority to the king and emphasized Pedro's failures. The language in the two letters, composed at the beginning of 1378, provide further insight into this power struggle. You will see that the handouts showing excerpts from the two letters only contain my translations. If you're interested in looking at the untranslated versions, let me know and I'll get it to you. In these letters, Pedro and Juan both employed the vernacular rather than the Latin. And the letters also lack a formal address, which I believe indicate that they're intended to be private. However, like many royal letters, and especially ones that concern such public activities as trials, there was little guarantee that their content would remain private for long. Consequently, it was essential that Pedro carefully defend his sovereignty in his letter against his son's challenge, and that the prince effectively advance his own authority and legitimacy in response, not only to convince the other, but also to persuade their unauthorized audience. Pedro recognized that Juan's prosecution of the Jews of Huesca was prompted by his desire to cast doubt on his father's weakened sovereignty. In a letter composed on January 26, 1378, Pedro appears to draw upon his own conception of kingship in order to defend and legitimize his authority and to negatively assess his son's rebellious actions. Ernst Kantorowicz has argued that some medieval rulers asserted a law-centered kingship, which imagined the ruler as the living law. In his letter, Pedro asserts that it was through the agency of those that ruled that justice was conducted. For example, Pedro asserted that, quote, "Since you are aware that we have striven to preserve the Jews in our kingdoms and lands during the times of war and tribulations, the Duke can and should preserve the Jews in times of peace and well-being," end quote. This statement suggested that as heir to the throne and governor general, Juan was a legal arbitrator of right and wrong. It was his duty to judge all under his jurisdiction justly. Rather than living up to his obligations, the prince had supported and sustained, quote, "offenses very rigorously against the Jews from the city of Huesca," end quote. Thus, Pedro pointed out that Juan had failed to fulfill one of the most important tenets of kingship. In doing so, the king suggested that, unlike Juan, he had always defended his subjects. Pedro also cohered with the body politic as described by Kantorowicz. According to his model of the body politic, the head dictates actions that were meant to preserve and protect the limbs, while the limbs served the head and were willing to sacrifice themselves for it. Towards the middle of his letter, Pedro urged Juan to, quote, "recognize the Jewish leadership in our realm before they move themselves to the lands of prelates, rich men, and knights and weaken us," end quote. In doing so, he implied that Juan must collaborate with his vassals so that they would remain loyal to the head and continue to provide the kingdom with their services. Instead of conducting himself in this manner, Juan had attacked an adjacent limb consisting of the Jewish community, possibly prompting their immigration to a safer region and the loss of their valuable financial services. Moreover, by contradicting his responsibilities as the head of a body politic, Juan also weakened the kingdom politically, since adversaries outside of Aragon and Catalonia might assume that the kingdom lacked the influence and resources necessary to retain such a valuable resource. Thus, by attacking the Jews of Huesca, the prince was not only fulfilling his goal of crippling the authority of the king, but he was damaging the entire body politic. Contrary to the actions of the prince, who would wound the corporate body of the king just to prove his authority, the king suggested that he had rightly used Jewish revenue for the good of the kingdom. Finally, Pedro's law-centered and polity-centered kingship was supported by the portrayal of a perpetual dynasty through the crown. Although the actual person of the king would die, the crown retained his laws and enactments in addition to those of his predecessors. At the end of his letter, Pedro declared that, quote, "You know well that we have always had the practice of conserving the Jewish community. Take these fruitful words to heart and continue to maintain them," end quote. This declaration emphasized Juan's divergence from the traditional practices of his esteemed ancestors. In addition, Pedro closed the letter by saying that, quote, "These orders we say to you are known and have been carried out in our kingdom for a long time," end quote. Thus, Pedro revealed that Juan was aware of this practice and was recklessly and rashly deviating from a tradition that had benefited the kingdom for many generations. The king, on the other hand, suggested that his own actions were the result of his adherence to the traditions of the crown, respected practices inherited from their royal ancestors. Thus, Pedro used his own principles of kingship to establish his son's bad leadership, while simultaneously depicting himself as a strong and experienced leader. In his effort to disparage Juan's attack on Pedro's sovereignty and to defend his own authority, Pedro also asserted what he believed was the proper approach to the kingdom's Jews. It's unclear whether Pedro believed that the Jews of Huesca were guilty of stealing the host, but in this case, I think this inquiry is inconsequential when determining Pedro's intention in the letter. As Yitzhak Beyer explains, it's unlikely that Pedro completely doubted the accusations, but he had a practical stake in the existence and well-being of the Jewish community. Indeed, the king needed the financial support of the Jews to prove the legitimacy of his sovereignty. Consequently, Pedro never even considered in his letter the possibility that the Jews of Huesca might be guilty of the charges against them. Instead, it was more important to prevent the Jews from leaving and weakening the kingdom and the king's authority. Thus, Pedro indicated that the proper approach was to brush aside such inflammatory accusations. Recognizing that Pedro was judging the prince's actions based on the king's understanding of sovereignty, Juan defined and advanced his own conception of kingship. When discussing the case of the Jews of Huesca in a letter composed on February 4, 1378, which is in direct reply to the letter from the king, the prince drew an obvious connection between himself and the divine. For example, at the very beginning of his letter, he stated that, quote, "The information that my council has uncovered was determined as a result of God's actions," end quote. This connection was further emphasized when Juan declared that, quote, "God has made it my duty to find the sacred host," end quote. This phrase indicates that Juan was drawing from a Christ-centered kingship that, contrary to Pedro's principles, was based in a liturgical philosophy. Kantorowicz explains that such a kingship recognized the ruler as Christ's, quote, "deputy on earth," end quote. This identification was key to Juan's goal to surpass and disparage his father's sovereignty. Although Juan's religious assertions cannot be completely dismissed as artificial, keeping in mind the context in which he was writing, I would suggest that Juan utilized this pietistic language in order to justify his prosecution of the Jews and to advance his own authority over his father. As David Nuremberg explains when describing the discourse about minorities that existed in the late Middle Ages, quote, "The choice of language was an active one, made in order to achieve something, made within context of conflict and structures of domination," end quote. By connecting his authority with the will of God, Juan was able to portray his sovereignty as more legitimate than Pedro's, which in turn enabled him to assume an authoritative voice in his letter. For example, he compelled the king to, quote, "Consider the neglect of your soul, and remember the grace that God has given you, and in doing so, do not challenge or punish me," end quote. Through these statements, Juan attested to his spiritual and earthly judicial authority, not only over the subjects of Huesca, but also over the king himself. Furthermore, by admonishing Pedro, the king reversed their relationship, portraying himself in a father-like role, responding to one who ought to be chided for his errors. This dominant voice was demonstrated even more severely towards the end of the letter, where Juan asserted that, quote, "Understand that I will find the sacred hosts if they have not already been pierced due to the delay of the trials that you have commanded," end quote. Thus, the prince also pointed to the potential consequences of the king's error in challenging his son's superior authority. In addition, Juan appeared to hold Pedro culpable for the Jews' seemingly defiant disposition in the trials. He explained that the Jews had, quote, "gossiped to one another, that my deference to money would cause me to pardon them," end quote. Through this statement, Juan referenced Pedro's approach to the Jews, suggesting that the king's reliance on the royal exchange of protection for revenue had allowed the Jews to become arrogant and consider themselves exempt from punishment. Thus, by defining his sovereignty as Christ-centered, Juan gained an authoritative voice over Pedro's kingship and his actions. From Juan's letter to his father, it's also possible to discern his policy towards the Jews of the kingdom. By stating unequivocally on 3 different occasions that the Jews still possessed the host, and that they believed they could buy their way out of the situation, Juan indicated that the king's suggestion that he brush away the charges was the wrong approach. Instead, by emphasizing the need to continue the trials, whether the alleged hosts were found or not, Juan advanced a persecutory approach to the Jews of Huesca and the general Jewish population, which would have a direct negative impact on his father's rule. By taking this approach, it would appear that Juan aimed to permanently sever the relationship between Pedro and the Jews, preventing his father from regaining his grasp on the kingdom. By placing the trials within the context of Pedro's reign, it is clear that Juan's prosecution of the Jews reflected a momentous power struggle between the king and his heir. Recognizing his father's contemporary political, economic, and social failings, Juan used the trials to cast doubt on his father's weakened sovereignty and to assert his own authority. Through an examination of 2 letters written by the king and the prince in 1378, it is apparent that the motivations of this confrontation was less influenced by the actual transgressions of the Jews, and were more driven by the authority that they provided and represented. Royal authority was at stake in the trials, and the potential to lose or gain that authority motivated the hostility that shook the town of Huesca during the years of 1377 and 1378. Thank you.